with the arrangements that we have made, which are now reflected in the text of the bill that the committee is marking up. Let me just mention some of the agreements we have achieved that are very important to the success of the coal industry. First of all, we have obtained the provision of 90% of the emission allowances to electric utilities without charge. And that was truly a major step forward that helps to cushion any effect on electricity rates because of the process by which emission allowances are allocated. Secondly, we've obtained 2 billion tons of offsets that will enable the emitting entities to obtain their reductions while continuing to use coal. Utilities will be able to continue their existing fuel mix by taking their reductions off-site, by investing in agriculture, by investing in forestry, and through other steps. 2 billion tons of offsets available every year for that purpose. The target for emission reductions by the year 2020 has been reduced from the original target that was set in the draft that Mr. Waxman circulated down to a target of 17%. I continue to have some concerns about that target. I believe a lower number actually is appropriate, and under the agreement that we've achieved, I intend to work at future stages of this process in order to obtain improvement, and I believe that is potentially possible. We also have bonus allowances for carbon capture and sequestration deployment by utilities at the time that these technologies become available, and those bonus allowances are valued at somewhere between $75 and $100 billion, depending upon what the then current value of emission allowances happens to be. We have embedded within the legislation our separate bill that assures the flow of $1 billion annually in research, development, and demonstration funding to the development of carbon capture and sequestration technologies. And the Electric Power Research Institute tells us that with that level of assured funding, we can count on available, affordable, and reliable carbon capture and sequestration technologies being made available by the year 2020. I can say that across the entire range of interested parties, from utilities to major companies within the coal industry to the United Mine Workers, there is uniform agreement that these are major step forwards. There is uniform agreement that this legislation, in the form in which you see it, should proceed through this committee, and there's also uniform agreement that we should continue to work for further improvements, and that's a cause to which I am certainly committed. Let me say that at the outset of this process, I had really hoped that we would have a bipartisan measure. And beginning more than 2 years ago, when we began the work on developing cap-and-trade legislation in the subcommittee, we extended a hand of partnership to our Republican colleagues. Unfortunately, that offer has been declined. That offer remains open, and I am hoping that at future steps in this process, that offer will in fact be accepted and that we will have bipartisan cooperation and help as we proceed to move this measure through the House and through subsequent steps in the legislative process. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield back my time.
Gentleman's time's expired. The vote will now occur on the Shimkus amendment. All in favor say aye. Opposed, no. Do you want to, hey, do you guys want a recorded vote on this? Do you want a recorded vote on this? Recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman, Mr. Dingle, Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey votes no. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Seshu votes no. Mr. Stupak? Mr. Stupak votes no. Mr. Engel? Mr. Green? Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette votes no. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps votes no. Mr. Doyle? Ms. Harmon? Ms. Harmon votes no. Ms. Shikowski? Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee votes no. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin votes no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Weiner? Mr. Weiner votes no. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Malison? Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes no. Mrs. Christensen? Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut? Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Space? Mr. Space, aye. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes no. Ms. Sutton? Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley votes no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall? Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns? Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal? Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Whitfield passes. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shadegg? Mr. Shadegg, aye. Mr. Blunt? Mr. Blunt votes aye. Mr. Boyer? Mr. Boyer, aye. Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Radonovich votes aye. Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bono Mack? Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick? Mrs. Myrick, aye. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania votes aye. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Burgess? Ms. Blackburn? Ms. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Gordon? Mr. Gordon, no. Mr. Rush? Mr. Rush? Mr. Rush votes no. Mr. Engel? Is he here? Nope. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle votes no. Mr. Melanson? No. Mr. Melanson votes no. Mr. Green? Mr. Green, no. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Waxman? Mr. Waxman, no.
Dr. Burgess recorded.
Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Whitfield is off pass and on aye.
Are there any other members wishing to vote? Clerk will report the tally.
On that vote, Madam Chair, the ayes were 22 and the nays were 34.
22 to 34, the amendment is not agreed to.